Hello, welcome to Chess with Simon. I'm Simon. I've been asked to look at another game from the OCA Cowley Blitz. This is TomShepherd as black against NotMaximeLagrave as white. d4, d5, c4, e6, so Queen's Gambit declined. Now black's playing the Tarrasch defence, or perhaps the semi-Tarrasch defence. The normal move for white is to take here. Now if black takes with the pawn, you get the Tarrasch defence where black gets activity, quick development of the pieces, knight c6, maybe the bishop coming to c5, castling, and then maybe getting the rooks on some of those open files. The E and the C file will be open. In exchange for that, black accepts the structural weakness of an isolated queen's pawn. So this is a completely valid opening where black is sort of trading off advantages and disadvantages. Tom's going to play it a different way. He takes with the knight, so this is the semi-Tarrasch defence. So this is more in the spirit of the Grunfeld, which Tom also plays. Pawn e4, then the knight's taking on c3, just as it does in the Grunfeld. Then an exchange on d4. c5 is also a very important move in the Grunfeld. But the difference here is black has very quick development. I mean, black has quick development in the Grunfeld, but even quicker here, because instead of playing g6, bishop g7, the bishop just comes straight out to b4 check. And he's exchanged off another pair of minor pieces. So what this means is that white does have a lovely centre, but actually black's space disadvantage is less of a problem because he doesn't have that many pieces to squeeze into the space. And you can see the advantage games here: Magnus Carlsen versus Dingley Wren, Magnus Carlsen versus Vladimir Kramnik, Magnus Carlsen versus someone else. Who is it? Vladimir Kramnik, 2016, 2019. So this is a very topical line played by the very best players. Black's castled, just really sensible, nice solid pawn structure. Bishop c4 is the book move, knight d7, castles, b6, developing that bishop. It's a really nice opening. White plays rook f d1. Now the standard approach here is to put the f rook on e1 and the a rook on d1 behind those two central pawns, but this is just a slight nuance on that. Black attacks the undefended pawn on e4, white defends it, and now black has attacked the bishop, and also just getting the rook onto the open file with tempo, which is always handy. White does the same. Black now again attacks the pawn. White defends it in this very novel way, actually. It's a very interesting move, and I think this took Stuart a minute to think. So a minute in a 3-minute game, that's a long time. This is a sort of creative moment really for Stuart, defending that pawn. And Tom very rationally thought, well, if I just nudge that knight away, I can have the pawn. But the knight then sacrifices itself on e6, and we see two pawns have gone for a piece now, but also white wins an exchange on the end. So I would say in material terms that's equal. In fact, you might even prefer two minor pieces to a rook and two pawns. But white has those two beautiful passed pawns in the centre, soon to have rooks behind them. And I think the black king is also a little bit windy, although white doesn't have a light squared bishop. So I think probably the computer's shown the advantage mainly because of those central pawns. Queen h4, black sets about attacking the central pawns. White just pushes, so that's a step further advanced, and now also they're defended. Again, Tom is attacking the pawn on e4, which is defended by a pawn, and now the computer believes white's quite a lot better. What's interesting is those pawns are very strong, and they're basically locking the bishop out of the game, and they're a real threat. But strangely, they become a weakness for white later in the game. There's a fascinating tactic. So swaps off a pair of rooks, and now the rook is attacking the bishop, which moves to b6. Queen g3 is a mistake because black can take on d5 here, and then if white takes back, there's a check on e3, which wins the rook. You really can't blame white here. White has 23 seconds, and so this move was played almost instantly, and it's a pretty hard tactic to see. So, Tom's got a minute and 13. Tom's got a little bit longer, but it's very, very quick, this. Queen a3, basically just attacking the rook. So the rook moves, and then there's a check. King goes in the corner. This looks a bit frightening for white, doesn't it? Because the back rank is a bit weak. So there's no immediate queen e1 because the queen takes, or an immediate queen c1 because the rook takes. But there is a tactic. Can you spot it? Please feel free to pause the video. Or even, if you're interested, the engine's already showing it. But even when you look at the engine, it takes a minute for the penny to drop, or at least it did for me. So knight h5, the point is that white has to keep defending e1. And so when the queen goes here, which is the only square that defends e1, black could have played g5 in this position. So let's see it on the board. Black could have played g5. And all of a sudden, white has no good square for the queen. I mean, the engine wants to go to g3, but you just take that with the knight. The point is that you can't move off the diagonal. You can't just take the knight because it's checkmate at the back. So again, I think that was a hard tactic to spot because it was so weird. But you could argue that white is slightly suffering from a dark square weakness there as well. With all these pawns on light squares. You could argue that. Black plays here. White realises the danger and creates some space for the king, some air for the king. Again, this is a natural move, right? Threatening checkmate in 1. Check from white with 3 seconds on the clock, sacrifices a rook and gets a perpetual. Now, actually, again, this is quite interesting. Here, black could have run to h5 and actually can run through the dark squares and escape the perpetual. So we just look at it. Let's see how it would go. So the engine wants queen a5. You then just run to h4. And now you've got to keep checking, right? If you don't keep checking, it's sort of the end of days because you can take on g2. I mean, the engine wants to go queen g7 defending the checkmate, but let's just, if you just keep checking, I mean, it's just running, right? Here, which is not pretty. In fact, is that what the engine wanted? Yeah, it is. So all of a sudden, black has 2 minors. I mean, white's got some pawns, but the white king is under serious threat there, I would say. So, actually, black could have slipped out. But, you know, these guys, they've got 4 seconds on the clock. And there's so many times you can spend an instant thinking about this stuff and just lose on time. So it's completely understandable. They both went for the perpetual check. And I think a draw is a fair result. So, you know, reflecting back, interesting theoretical opening. I think the semi-Tarrasch is definitely worth thinking about as a defence. It's quite hard for white to avoid. It's quite solid, and it's just a good opening. Really smart tactic from white, this idea of taking on e6. Really inventive. And yeah, there was this pretty tactic towards the end that was hard to see, but I think instructive for all of us because it's good to look out for those sort of things in future games. I mean, the way to have seen it would have been to say, look, the back rank's weak. White just has to keep covering the square e1. How can we just mess with the white queen? That would have been the way to see it. But, you know, with 8 seconds on the clock, that's asking a great deal, you know. Magnus might have managed it, but for us mortals, it's all very hard. Hope you're all enjoying yourself, and I'll see you soon.